The candlelight of 1,000 beeswax tapers trembled in the grand ballroom of Lancaster House, each flame a captured star reflected in the polished marble floors and the facets of innumerable jewels. To Lady Seraphina Beaumont, the air itself seemed thick with gilded dust, a shimmering haze of perfume, powder, and the collective, breathless anticipation of the London season. It was a world she was meant to conquer, or at least to gracefully inhabit. Yet, standing beside her betrothed, Viscount Harrington, she felt a profound and unsettling sense of displacement, as if she were watching the scene through a pane of very old, slightly warped glass. Viscount Harrington, or Edward, as he insisted she call him in their more private moments, was the very picture of aristocratic perfection. His blonde hair was artfully arranged, his evening attire was impeccably tailored, and the smile he bestowed upon the titled matrons and their hopeful daughters was a masterpiece of practiced charm. He held her gloved hand in his, a proprietary gesture that should have felt reassuring. Instead, it felt like a brand, marking her as his possession before the entirety of the ton. "You are looking particularly fetching tonight, my dear," he murmured, his voice a low counterpoint to the swell of the string quartet. "That shade of blue, it does wonders for your eyes." Seraphina offered a small, practiced smile in return. "You are too kind, my lord." The gown, a silken creation the color of a twilight sky, had cost her father far more than he could truly afford. It was an investment, he had called it, in the family's future. In her future, a future that was now inextricably bound to the man beside her. She knew she should be ecstatic. Viscount Harrington was handsome, titled, and wealthy enough to rescue the Beaumont estate from the precipice of ruin upon which it had teetered for a generation. Every young lady in the room envied her. She knew this because she could feel the weight of their gazes, some sharp with jealousy, others coolly speculative. Yet a persistent disquiet coiled in her stomach. It was in the way Edward's eyes would sometimes skim over her face, as if searching for something that wasn't there. It was in the fleeting moments when his smile did not quite reach his eyes, revealing a sliver of something cold and calculating beneath. She had tried to dismiss these feelings as bridal nerves, as the natural apprehension of a life about to be irrevocably changed. Her maid, Elspeth, had told her as much, patting her hand and speaking of how all new things felt strange at first. But the feeling persisted, a tiny, sharp stone in her slipper. Her gaze drifted across the glittering throng, past the preening peacocks and the whispering hens of the society matriarchs, and snagged on a figure standing near the shadowed alcoves by the French doors. The crowd seemed to part around him, an invisible tide receding from a dark, unmoving rock. It was Alistair, the Duke of Blackwood. He was a man more myth than reality in London circles, appearing so rarely that each sighting was an event to be dissected and whispered about for weeks. He was dressed in stark, unforgiving black that absorbed the candlelight rather than reflecting it. He was tall, broader of shoulder than the other men, with an air of stillness that was more intimidating than any overt display of power. His face was all harsh angles and stark planes, as if carved from granite, and his dark hair was unadorned, but it was his eyes that held her. From across the cavernous room she could feel their intensity. They were not merely looking, they were assessing, judging, and dismissing everything they saw with a profound weariness. A terrible tragedy had befallen him years ago, the details of which were always spoken of in hushed, morbid tones. A fire, a young wife lost, a life of self-imposed exile at his forbidding country estate. Looking at him now, Seraphina saw not a monster, but a man hollowed out by grief. The sorrow so palpable it seemed to cool the very air around him. A shiver traced its way down her spine. He was the antithesis of the glittering, superficial world around them, a shard of unvarnished reality in a room of illusions. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second, a fleeting, startling connection across the expanse of marble and silk. She saw a flicker of something, surprise perhaps, or a shared recognition of solitude, before his expression shuttered once more, becoming as remote and impenetrable as the moon. She quickly looked away, her heart thrumming a nervous rhythm against her ribs. "Staring at the beast in his cage, Seraphina?" Edward's voice was laced with a faint, mocking amusement. He had followed her gaze. "Best be careful. They say he devours hopeful debutantes for sport." "I was merely curious," she replied, her voice quieter than she intended. "One hears so many stories." "All of them true, I imagine," he said with a dismissive shrug. "A man haunted by his own demons. Best to leave him to it." He tightened his grip on her hand, drawing her attention back to him. "Now, come. Lady Danbury is waving us over. We must pay our respects. And do try to look happy, my dear. You are to be a viscountess after all. It is the envy of every woman here." His words were meant to be a balm, a reminder of her good fortune, but they landed like stones, each one a weight pressing down on her spirit. She allowed him to lead her through the crowd, her twilight blue skirts whispering against the floor. She smiled, she curtsied, she murmured the correct pleasantries. She played the part of the blissful bride-to-be, all the while feeling the Duke of Blackwood's somber presence at the edge of the room like a looming storm cloud on a perfect summer's day. She could not shake the feeling that the polished floor beneath her feet was not solid at all, but a thin veneer of ice, and that she was dancing on the verge of a catastrophic collapse. The air grew heavier, the music seeming to thin and stretch into a discordant whine that only she could hear. The collapse, she would soon learn, was closer and more complete than she could ever have imagined. The waltz ended on a final triumphant chord, and the dancers scattered into laughing, chattering groups. Edward led her towards the center of the room, his hand firm at the small of her back. A strange hush began to fall over their immediate vicinity, a ripple of silence spreading outwards. Serafina glanced around, confused. Faces that had been animated with gossip were now still, their expressions a mixture of shock and avid curiosity. They were all looking at her, at them. "Edward!" she whispered, a cold dread seeping into her veins. "What is it?" He released her, stepping back a single, deliberate pace. The small distance felt like a chasm opening between them. His charming smile was gone, replaced by a look of cool, almost bored dismissal. "Lady Serafina," he began, his voice carrying with perfect clarity in the sudden, expectant silence, "it is with the deepest regret that I must inform you, and indeed all of our esteemed company, that our understanding has come to an end." The words struck her with the physical force of a blow. The air rushed from her lungs. The room, with its 1,000 candles, tilted violently. What are you saying?" she managed, her voice a thread of sound. "I am saying," he continued, seeming to relish the drama of the moment, "that our engagement is terminated. Circumstances have changed. My affections, I have come to realize, have been irrevocably engaged elsewhere." As if on cue, a path cleared, and Lady Isolde Croft, her face a mask of triumphant pity, glided to Edward's side. She was an heiress of immense fortune, her crimson gown a slash of vibrant color against the pastels of the other ladies. She slipped her hand into the crook of Edward's arm, the one that had held Serafina's only moments before. The collective gasp of the room was a physical thing, a wave of sound that washed over Serafina, threatening to drown her. Humiliation, hot and sharp, pierced through the initial shock. He was doing this here, publicly, deliberately. It was not merely a breaking of a promise, it was a social execution. He was destroying her, and by extension, her family, in a single brutal act. The whispers started then, venomous and quick like the striking of snakes. Her father's finances always knew it was a desperate match. Poor creature, utterly ruined. Serafina stood frozen, pinned in place by 100 pairs of eyes. She could feel the blood draining from her face, her hands turning to ice in their pristine white gloves. She wanted to run, to scream, to simply vanish, but her feet seemed to have taken root in the cold marble floor. She looked at Edward, searching for some flicker of remorse, some hint of the man she thought she knew. She found nothing but a cold, hard finality. He had used her, and now, having found a more valuable prize, he was discarding her with calculated cruelty. Her world had narrowed to a single point of unbearable shame. The music had stopped. The laughter had ceased. There was only the sound of her own heart hammering in her ears, and the rising tide of whispers that would follow her for the rest of her days. She was no longer Lady Serafina Beaumont, the promising daughter of an earl. She was a cautionary tale, a public spectacle of rejection. And then, through the haze of her despair, a shadow moved. A figure detached itself from the wall, moving with a quiet, deliberate grace that belied his size. The whispers died instantly as the Duke of Blackwood cut a path through the gawking crowd. He stopped directly in front of her, his height and the stark black of his coat eclipsing the rest of the room. He blocked her from the prying eyes, creating a small, quiet space in the midst of the maelstrom. He did not smile. He did not offer words of comfort. He simply looked at her, his dark eyes holding hers with an unnerving intensity. In their depths she saw not pity, but something that looked startlingly like understanding. He extended a gloved hand. "Lady Serafina," he said, his voice a low, resonant baritone that cut through the silence. It was the first time she had ever heard him speak. It held the deep, quiet power of a river running through stone. She could only stare at his offered hand, uncomprehending. He did not retract it. He waited, his patience a tangible force. Then, leaning closer so that only she could hear, he spoke again, the words precise, devoid of all emotion, a statement of fact. "Viscount Harrington has demonstrated a profound lack of character. His loss is, I assure you, your gain. However, you now find yourself in an untenable position, as do I." He paused, his gaze unwavering. I require a duchess to manage my household and provide a semblance of stability for my daughter. You require a name and a position that will silence these vultures. Marry me, Lady Seraphina. It will be a contract, a partnership of convenience. I will offer you my name, my protection, and my fortune. I will ask for nothing of your heart, and I will offer none of my own in return. It will be a business arrangement, nothing more. The proposition was so audacious, so utterly cold and practical, that it shocked her out of her paralysis. He was offering her a lifeline, but it was a line woven from ice and shadow, to exchange one gilded cage for another, infinitely colder and more mysterious one. But as she looked from the Duke's stoic face to the smirking visage of her former fiancé and the sea of scornful, judgmental eyes, she knew she had no other choice. Ruin was a certainty. This was an unknown, her hand, when she raised it, trembled slightly, but her fingers were steady as she placed them in his. His grip was firm, cool, and surprisingly gentle. "Yes, Your Grace," she heard herself say, her own voice sounding distant and strange. "I accept." The Duke of Blackwood straightened to his full height, his hand still holding hers. He turned his gaze upon the stunned assembly, his expression one of utter, chilling command. "Allow me to be the first," he announced, his voice ringing with an authority that no one in the room dared to challenge, "to congratulate my fiancée, the future Duchess of Blackwood." A new wave of gasps, this time of pure, unadulterated shock, swept the ballroom. Seraphina stood beside him, a tempest of confusion, fear, and a tiny, defiant spark of survival roaring within her. She had been publicly shattered, and in the space of a heartbeat, she had been remade into something else entirely. She was no longer the jilted bride-to-be, but the chosen of the enigmatic, formidable Duke. She had stepped from one fire into another, and she had no idea if she would be consumed or forged anew. The only certainty was that her life, as she had known it, was over. The journey to Blackwood Manor was conducted in a silence as heavy and oppressive as the gathering clouds outside the carriage window. The marriage had been a swift, sterile affair, a legal transaction conducted in a dusty London office with only her shell-shocked father and the Duke's solicitor as witnesses. There were no flowers, no well-wishes, only the scratching of a pen and the finality of a wax seal. Now she was the Duchess of Blackwood, a title that felt as foreign and ill-fitting as the plain gold band on her finger. Her husband, the word was a shock in her thoughts, sat opposite her, his gaze fixed on the passing landscape. He had not spoken more than a handful of necessary words to her since his shocking proposal in the ballroom. He was a fortress, and she had no map to its gates, let alone its inner sanctum. She studied his profile against the grey light, the strong line of his jaw, the severe set of his mouth, the faint lines of exhaustion or sorrow etched around his eyes. He seemed more a monument to some forgotten grief than a living man. Seraphina smoothed the fabric of her dark-grey travelling dress, her hands restless in her lap. The silence stretched, becoming a living thing between them, a third passenger in the well-sprung carriage. She felt a desperate need to break it, to say something, anything to prove she was not merely a piece of cargo being transported to its new location. "The countryside is very green," she offered, the words sounding feeble and absurd as soon as they left her lips. Alistair's gaze shifted from the window to her face. For a moment she thought he might not reply at all. "It often is in England," he said, his voice flat, devoid of inflection. The statement was not unkind, merely factual, yet it served its purpose perfectly. The conversation was over before it had begun. The walls of his fortress were as high and as smooth as ever. She fell silent again, a blush of foolishness warming her cheeks. She turned her own attention to the window, watching as rolling hills gave way to a wilder, more dramatic landscape. The trees grew taller and thicker, their branches clawing at the sky. A persistent drizzle began to fall, tracing sad, meandering paths down the glass. The weather seemed to be mirroring the bleakness of her own heart. Blackwood Manor appeared suddenly, a vast Gothic silhouette against the bruised sky. It was not a house, it was a statement. Built of dark, weathered stone, it loomed from its perch on a rugged tor, all sharp angles, turrets, and unblinking mullioned windows. It looked less like a home and more like a prison, beautiful but forbidding. As the carriage rolled to a stop on the crunching gravel of the drive, Seraphina felt a profound sense of finality. This was her new life. This was her cage. The Duke alighted first, turning to offer her his hand. It was a gesture of pure, automatic courtesy, his touch as impersonal as it had been on their wedding day. She accepted it, her feet finding the solid ground with a sense of trepidation. The air was colder here, scented with damp earth, pine, and the faint, mournful cry of a distant rook. The great oak doors swung open as they approached, revealing a cavernous hall. The interior was as imposing as the exterior. Dark wood paneling soared 2 stories to a vaulted ceiling from which hung a massive iron chandelier, unlit, despite the gloom of the day. A gallery ran along the upper level, its shadows deep and secretive. The air inside was still and cold, carrying the faint, dusty scent of disuse. The silence was absolute, broken only by the echo of their footsteps on the flagstone floor. A woman stood waiting for them in the center of the hall. She was tall and severe, dressed in stark black bombazine, her grey hair pulled back into a bun so tight it seemed to tug at the corners of her eyes. Her expression was one of dour neutrality. "Your Grace," she said, her voice as crisp and starched as her collar. She executed a short, sharp curtsy. Her gaze flickered over Serafina for a fraction of a second, assessing and unreadable, before returning to the Duke. "Mrs. Gable," Alistair acknowledged with a nod. "This is the Duchess. See that her things are taken to the East Wing. Have a fire lit. She will require a maid. Find someone suitable." Each sentence was a command, delivered with an economy that left no room for discussion. He spoke of her as if she were not there. "Of course, Your Grace," the housekeeper replied. Alistair then turned to Serafina, his expression as remote as ever. "Mrs. Gable is my housekeeper. She runs the estate. You will find she is efficient. Your rooms are in the East Wing. Mine are in the West. We will dine together at 8. Punctuality is appreciated. Until then, I have matters in my study that require my attention." He did not wait for a response. He simply turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing down a long, dark corridor until they were swallowed by the immense silence of the house. Serafina was left standing in the center of the great hall with the formidable Mrs. Gable. The cold of the flagstones seemed to seep up through the soles of her boots. She felt utterly, terrifyingly alone. "If you will follow me, Your Grace," Mrs. Gable said, her tone implying it was not a request. She led Serafina up a grand, sweeping staircase, its banister smooth and cool beneath her gloved hand. The portraits that lined the walls watched her pass, their painted eyes seeming to follow her with silent judgment. They were Blackwood's ancestors, a gallery of stern-faced men and women who looked as unyielding as the house they inhabited. The East Wing was a long, quiet corridor. Mrs. Gable stopped before a set of double doors and pushed one open. "Your apartments, Your Grace, the sitting room, bedroom, and dressing room. A fire will be laid shortly. Your maid will be up as soon as one is assigned." The rooms were spacious and handsomely appointed, with heavy damask curtains and dark polished furniture. But like the rest of the house, they felt cold and unlived in. A film of dust lay on the mantelpiece, and the air was stale. It was clear no one had occupied this wing for a very long time. It was a place for a guest, not for the lady of the house. The message was unmistakable. She was an outsider here, a necessary addition, but not a welcome one. Before Serafina could speak, a small sound from the far end of the corridor caught her attention. Peeking from behind a large suit of armor was a small, pale face, framed by a mass of untamed dark curls. It was a child, a little girl of no more than 6 or 7, her eyes wide and dark in her solemn face. She was clutching a worn, stuffed rabbit to her chest. This must be Lily, the Duke's daughter. As soon as their eyes met, the child gasped and darted back out of sight. "Who was that?" Serafina asked, her voice soft. Mrs. Gable's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "That is Lady Lillian. She is shy. It is best not to approach her directly. She does not take well to strangers." The housekeeper's tone was dismissive, closing the subject as firmly as the Duke had closed his conversations. With a final stiff nod, Mrs. Gable departed, leaving Serafina alone in her new quarters. The silence rushed back in, more profound than before. She walked over to the tall window and looked out. Below, a vast, sprawling garden lay in a state of utter neglect, choked with weeds and tangled, overgrown rose bushes. Beyond it, a high stone wall separated it from the wild moorland. This, then, was to be her life, a cold, silent house, a husband who was a stranger and intended to remain one, a ghost of a child who fled from her sight, and rooms in a separate wing, a clear and stark delineation of the emotional chasm that lay between her and the master of the house. Alistair had been explicit in his terms. This was a contract. He had promised her his name and his protection, but nothing more, and as she stood in the chilling silence of Blackwood Manor, she understood with perfect, heart-sinking clarity that he had meant every word. The truce was established, cold and brittle as a winter frost. Her role was to endure it. The days at Blackwood Manor bled into one another, a uniform grey tapestry of silence and solitude. Serafina's life quickly settled into a rigid, lonely routine. She would rise, breakfast alone in her private sitting room, and then face a long expanse of hours with nothing to fill them. She attempted to assume the duties of a duchess, approaching Mrs. Gable to inquire about the household menus or the running of the staff, but she was met with a polite, impenetrable wall of efficiency. The housekeeper had been running Blackwood for years, She did not require, nor did it seem she desired, any input from the new nominal lady of the house. Dinner was the only time she saw her husband. The meal was served precisely at 8 in a dining hall so vast their 2 seats at opposite ends of the long polished table felt like separate lonely islands. The conversation, if it could be called that, was sparse and stilted. Alistair would inquire if her day had been satisfactory. She would reply that it had. He would comment on the weather or some minor matter of estate business. She would murmur her agreement, and then silence would descend again, broken only by the clinking of silver on porcelain and the discreet footsteps of the servants. She learned more about him from observation than from conversation. She saw the way he would sometimes stare into the middle distance, his fork poised forgotten over his plate, his eyes clouded with a sorrow so deep it seemed to pull all the light from the room. She noticed the tension in his jaw, the way his hands would clench by his side when he thought she was not looking. He was a man perpetually at war with his own memories. She saw even less of the child, Lily. The little girl was a phantom in her own home, a fleeting glimpse of dark curls in a doorway, the soft patter of feet in a distant hallway. She was cared for by a stern-faced governess who whisked her away whenever Serafina drew near. The child's silence was as profound as her father's, her large dark eyes filled with a watchfulness that was unnerving in one so young. Serafina's heart ached for her. She saw in Lily a reflection of her own isolation, a small soul adrift in a sea of adult grief. The crushing weight of her own loneliness began to feel unbearable. She was a duchess, the mistress of a great estate, and yet she had no purpose, no connection, no one to speak to beyond the formal pleasantries she exchanged with the staff. Elspeth, her loyal maid from home, had not been permitted to accompany her. The Duke, through Mrs. Gable, had informed her that a local girl had been hired. The new maid was competent but quiet, intimidated by her new mistress and the somber atmosphere of the house. One bleak afternoon, driven by a desperate need for air and space, Serafina pulled on a cloak and stepped out into the gardens. The neglect she had observed from her window was even more shocking up close. What had once been a place of magnificent beauty was now a testament to decay. Weeds grew thick and tenacious, strangling the life from what remained of the formal beds. Rose bushes, unpruned for years, had grown into a thorny, tangled wilderness. A stone bird bath was green with moss and filled with stagnant rainwater. The entire garden seemed to be holding its breath, suffocating under a blanket of sorrow and neglect. In the center of the chaotic wilderness she found a wrought iron gate, its hinges rusted shut, half swallowed by a curtain of ivy. With some effort she managed to force it open. It groaned in protest, a sound that echoed the ache in her own spirit. Beyond it lay a smaller, walled garden. This space was even more desolate. A sundial lay toppled on its side, its face obscured by creeping vines. The flagstone paths were fractured and uneven, pushed apart by stubborn roots. But even in its ruin, she could see the ghost of a masterful design. This had been someone's sanctuary. She found an old man with a back as bent as a willow branch, patiently weeding a small, struggling patch of herbs near the kitchen door. He introduced himself as Mr. Abernathy, the head gardener, though he admitted with a sad shake of his head that he was the only gardener now. "This walled garden," Serafina asked gently, it has been left for a long time." Abernathy's weathered face grew somber. He took off his cap, twisting it in his gnarled hands. "Aye, your grace, it has, since the late Duchess, since the accident. This was her place. Her heart was in this soil. The Duke, he couldn't bear to look at it after, gave the order it was to be left, locked, just as she left it." The words settled over Serafina, heavy with understanding. This garden was not just neglected, it was a memorial, a sealed tomb of memory. Alistair hadn't let it die from apathy, but from a pain so profound he could not even stand to witness its beauty. A quiet, stubborn resolve began to form within her. She would not be a ghost in this house. She would not suffocate in the silence. If she could not bring life to its cold stone corridors, perhaps she could bring it here, to this forgotten patch of earth. It was a small, quiet act of defiance against the despair that threatened to consume them all. "Mr. Abernathy," she said, her voice firm with a purpose she had not felt in months, "I should like to restore this garden. Will you help me?" The old gardener looked at her, his pale blue eyes wide with surprise, and then with a dawning respect. A slow smile creased his face, the first genuine smile she'd seen since arriving at Blackwood. "It would be my greatest honor, your grace," he said, his voice thick with emotion. And so her work began. It was slow, back-breaking labor. She traded her silk gowns for practical broadcloth, her delicate slippers for sturdy boots. Side by side with Abernathy, she knelt in the damp earth, her hands protected by thick leather gloves, pulling at stubborn weeds and clearing away years of debris. They righted the sundial, they uncovered the lost paths, they pruned the wild, overgrown roses, cutting away the dead wood to allow for new growth. She found a strange peace in the physical exertion, a solace in the tangible progress. Each cleared bed, each untangled vine, felt like a small victory against the oppressive gloom of the manor. She was not merely tending a garden, she was reclaiming a space from the clutches of sorrow. She was breathing life back into a place that had been left to die. Her new routine did not go unnoticed. Sometimes as she worked, she would feel a prickling on the back of her neck, the sensation of being watched. Looking up, she would see the small, pale face of Lily in one of the upper windows, her eyes following Serafina's every move. Serafina would offer a small, gentle smile, and the child would duck away, but she always returned. One afternoon, Serafina found a small, perfectly formed bird's nest that had fallen from a tree. She placed it carefully on the stone wall, near a path Lily sometimes used. The next day it was gone. Another day she began sketching the flowers as they started to emerge from the cleared soil. Snowdrops, then crocuses, their vibrant color a shock against the winter-brown earth. She left one of the drawings on a garden bench, a simple rendering of a purple crocus. The next morning the drawing was gone, and in its place was a single smooth white stone. They were small, silent exchanges, a fragile bridge being built across the chasm of fear and loneliness that separated them. She was patient. She did not push. She simply created a space of quiet beauty and waited, hoping the lonely little girl would one day find the courage to cross it. Her husband, too, was watching. She would catch glimpses of his tall figure in the window of his study, which overlooked the walled garden. He never came down. He never spoke of it during their silent dinners. But he watched. His observation was a constant, silent presence. She did not know if he approved or disapproved, if he was angry at her intrusion into this sacred, painful space, or if some part of him was relieved. His face, seen from a distance, remained an unreadable mask, but he watched, and in a house of crushing silence, to be seen was, in itself, a form of communication. It was a start. The first frost of late autumn had silvered the overgrown lawn, making each blade of grass a delicate shard of glass. Serafina was on her knees, her fingers numb with cold despite her gloves, carefully transplanting a cluster of resilient winter aconites. The work in the garden had become her anchor, a daily ritual that grounded her in a reality of soil, root, and patient growth. It was a world away from the echoing silence of the manor. As she firmed the earth around the small yellow-flowered plants, she noticed a book lying on the stone bench beside her work basket. It was not hers. It was a handsome volume, bound in dark green leather, its title embossed in faded gold, an illustrated compendium of British flora. It was old, clearly well-loved. Puzzled, she picked it up. There was no one else in the garden. Mr. Abernathy was in the potting shed, and the rest of the grounds were deserted. She opened the cover. The paper was thick and creamy, the illustrations within exquisite hand-painted watercolors of breathtaking detail and accuracy. But it was the inscription on the flyleaf that made her breath catch in her throat. In elegant, looping script it read, "To my dearest Ilara, may you always find beauty in the wild things. All my love, A. Ilara," the name of the late Duchess. This was her book, and A could only be Alistair. A chill, entirely unrelated to the autumn air, traced its way down her spine. He had left it for her. Her husband, the silent, remote man who watched her from his window, had come down into the garden when she was not there and left this deeply personal object for her to find. It was not a gift, not in the conventional sense. There was no note, no acknowledgement. It was a gesture as silent and complicated as the man himself. Was it a test, a warning, or was it something else? A quiet admission, perhaps, that he saw what she was doing, an offering, a piece of the past entrusted to her care. She ran her fingers over the inscription, over the ghost of a love and a life that had ended in tragedy within these very walls. The book felt impossibly heavy in her hands, weighted with a history she could not comprehend. She took it with her that evening, keeping it in her sitting room. She did not mention it at dinner. To do so would be to break the unspoken rule of their coexistence, to demand an explanation he was clearly unwilling to give. But the book's presence changed something in her. It was the first crack in the wall of his solitude, a sign that he was aware of her not just as a presence in his house, but as a person with interests that mirrored those of the wife he had lost. The thought was both saddening and strangely hopeful. A few days later, another small event shifted the delicate balance of the household. Serafina was in the garden, sketching a late-blooming hellebore, when she saw Lily creep out of a side door. The child kept to the shadows of the wall, her movements furtive, as if she were expecting to be reprimanded at any moment. She was watching Serafina, her dark eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination. Instead of turning to acknowledge her directly, which Serafina knew would make her flee, she continued to sketch but began to speak softly, as if to herself. "I think this one is called a Lenten rose," she murmured, her charcoal stick whispering across the page. "Isn't that a lovely name? It's very brave to bloom when it is still so cold. Most of the other flowers are sleeping, but this one is awake." She risked a glance from the corner of her eye. Lily had stopped, her small body frozen, listening. She was still clutching the threadbare rabbit. Serafina finished the sketch and carefully tore the page from her book. She placed it on the bench, weighting it down with a stone, and then gathered her things. "There," she said again to the air. "Now I shall remember it." She walked slowly back towards the house, deliberately not looking back. From the window of her sitting room she watched. After a long, hesitant moment, Lily darted forward. Her small hand snatched the drawing from the bench. She stared at it for a full minute before clutching it to her chest and scurrying back inside, a small, secretive treasure hunter. A warmth spread through Serafina's chest, a fragile tendril of hope. The true glimmer, the first undeniable thaw, came a week later. Serafina had been working late in the garden, trying to wrap the more delicate rose bushes in burlap before the first hard freeze. The sun had set and a cold, damp mist was rolling in from the moors, blurring the edges of the world. She was chilled to the bone, and her muscles ached. As she finally headed inside, stamping the mud from her boots, she heard a small, choked sound from the direction of the formal drawing room, a room they never used. Curiosity piqued, she pushed the heavy door open a crack. The room was dark, save for the weak moonlight filtering through the tall windows. In the center of the room, standing before a large dust-sheeted object, was Lily. The little girl was crying, not loud, wailing sobs, but a series of quiet, hiccuping gasps of utter misery. Serafina's heart clenched. She slipped into the room, her footsteps silent on the thick carpet. "Lily!" she whispered. The child started, her head whipping around, her eyes wide with panic. She looked like a frightened fawn, poised for flight. "It's all right," Serafina said, keeping her voice low and calm. She did not move closer. "I won't hurt you. What's the matter?" Lily's gaze darted from Serafina to the sheeted object. She lifted a trembling hand and pointed. Her music," she whispered, the words so faint they were barely audible. It was the first time Serafina had ever heard her speak. Understanding dawned. She walked slowly to the object and carefully lifted a corner of the dust sheet. Beneath it was a beautiful grand piano, its polished rosewood gleaming even in the dim light. "Your mother played?" Serafina asked gently. Lily nodded, a fresh wave of tears spilling down her pale cheeks. She would play for me every night, a song about the stars." Serafina's heart broke for the lonely little girl. Haunted by the silence where music used to be, she looked down at the silent keys. She herself played, though not with any great talent. It had been part of her education as a lady. Would you like to hear it again?" Serafina asked, her voice barely a whisper. "The piano, I mean, not the song about the stars, I don't know that one. But another song, perhaps." Lily stared at her, her tear-filled eyes searching Serafina's face. After a long moment, she gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. Serafina pulled off the entire sheet, the canvas making a soft sighing sound as it fell to the floor. She sat on the bench, the ivory keys cool beneath her fingertips. She hesitated, then began to play a simple, quiet lullaby, a melody her own mother had played for her years ago. The notes were soft, hesitant at first in the vast, silent room, but they slowly gained confidence, filling the cold air with a gentle, melancholy sweetness. She did not look at Lily. She focused on the music, pouring all of her empathy, all of her own loneliness and sorrow into the simple tune. She played for the lost mother, for the silent child, and for the grieving father. She played until the last note faded into the shadows. The silence that followed was different. It was not empty. It was filled with the echo of the music, with a shared, unspoken emotion. She finally turned. Lily was standing right beside the piano, her small hand resting on the polished wood, her tears having subsided. She was looking at Serafina with an expression of profound, wondering gratitude. And in the doorway, half hidden in the shadows, stood the Duke. He was absolutely still, his face a mask of stone, but it was a different kind of mask than the one he usually wore. This one was fragile. His eyes were fixed on his daughter, and then on Serafina, and in their depths she saw a maelstrom of emotion, pain, shock, and something else, something she could not name. It was raw, unguarded, and deeply vulnerable. It was as if she had inadvertently unlocked a door he had kept bolted for years, and he was staring, stunned, at what had been let out. He did not speak. He simply watched them for a long, breathless moment. The air crackled with unspoken words, with years of repressed grief. Then, as quietly as he had appeared, He retreated back into the shadows and was gone. But he had been there. He had seen, he had felt something. And for the first time since she had arrived at Blackwood Manor, Seraphina felt the faintest, most fragile glimmer of hope that the winter might not last forever. The incident at the piano, though never spoken of, subtly altered the atmosphere of the house. A fragile truce had been established between Seraphina and Lily. The child no longer fled from her sight. Instead, she would appear silently at Seraphina's side as she worked in the garden, watching with her solemn dark eyes. She still rarely spoke, but her presence was a constant, a quiet companionship that Seraphina cherished. She would hand Seraphina a trowel or point out a ladybug on a leaf. They were small gestures, but they were the foundations of a tentative trust. Alistair, too, had changed. The wall of his indifference was still present, but it now seemed to have small hairline fractures. At their silent dinners, his gaze would sometimes linger on her face for a moment longer than necessary. Once, when she mentioned to Mr. Abernathy that she needed a stronger trellis for a climbing rose, a new one, perfectly constructed, appeared by the garden wall the next morning. There was no note, no acknowledgement, but she knew these were his only language, silent, practical actions that spoke of an attention he would never voice. Their fragile peace, however, was destined to be shattered. A letter arrived one morning on a silver salver, its crisp cream envelope addressed in a familiar, elegant hand. It was from Lady Isolde Harrington, the woman who had taken Seraphina's place. It was a short, cloyingly sweet note, announcing that she and her new husband, the Viscount, would be in the neighborhood and would be delighted to call upon the Duke and his new Duchess. Seraphina's blood ran cold. The note was not a polite inquiry, it was a challenge, a power play. Isolde and Edward wanted to see her in her new life, to gauge her happiness, and she had no doubt to flaunt their own. It was a deliberate act of social aggression, designed to humiliate her. She found Alistair in his study, a room she had never before entered. It was a masculine space, smelling of leather, old paper, and wood smoke. Bookshelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, and a massive oak desk stood before a window overlooking the now dormant garden. He looked up as she entered, his expression unreadable. "Your Grace," she began, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "We are to have visitors." She handed him the letter. He read it, his face betraying no emotion. He placed it carefully on his desk. "I see. We can say we are not at home," she suggested, a hopeful note in her voice. "We can refuse them." Alistair leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepling before him. He studied her for a long moment. "And what message would that send, Duchess? It would send the message that you are hiding, that their presence affects you. It would give them the victory they so clearly seek. No, we will not refuse them. We will receive them." A knot of dread tightened in her stomach. "I do not think I can—" "You can," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "You are the Duchess of Blackwood. This is your home. You will meet them with your head held high, and you will give them nothing. You will be gracious, you will be composed, and you will be utterly, unshakably indifferent. Let them see that their petty cruelties have no power here." His words, though devoid of warmth, were strangely fortifying. He was not offering comfort, he was offering strategy. He was treating this not as an emotional trial, but as a battle to be won. He was, for the first time, including her as his ally. They were a united front. "I will not allow them to disrespect you in my house," he added, his voice dropping to a lower, more dangerous register. The protective quality in his tone was unmistakable, and it sent a surprising jolt of warmth through her. The day of the visit arrived, grey and overcast. Seraphina dressed with meticulous care in a gown of deep emerald velvet, a color that spoke of strength and vitality. She wore her hair in a simple, elegant chignon, her only adornment a small pearl pin. She looked, she thought with a flicker of satisfaction, every inch a duchess. She found Alistair waiting for her at the bottom of the grand staircase. He, too, was impeccably dressed in a dark, perfectly tailored coat. He looked at her, his eyes traveling from the crown of her head to the hem of her gown, and for the first time she saw a flicker of genuine admiration in his gaze. He offered her his arm. "They will be no match for you," he said quietly as they walked towards the main drawing-room. Viscount Harrington and Lady Isolde were as polished and smug as she remembered. Edward was all false bonhomie, greeting Alistair with an easy familiarity that the Duke did not return. Isolde, draped in jewel-toned silk and dripping with diamonds, swept her gaze around the grand, somber room with a condescending air. "My dear Seraphina," Isolde cooed, extending a limp hand, "how rustic this all is. You must be finding it a terrible adjustment after the vibrancy of London, but I am so very pleased to see you looking so, well—" The unspoken addendum, considering your public humiliation, hung in the air between them. "Lady Harrington," Serafina replied, her voice cool and even. She did not take the offered hand. It is true, Blackwood is a world away from London. We value peace and substance here, over noise and superficiality. It is an adjustment I have found most welcome. Isolde's smile tightened at the subtle rebuke. Edward, meanwhile, was attempting to engage Alistair. I must say, Blackwood, you've landed on your feet, a beautiful wife to warm this old mausoleum, though I confess I was surprised. After the tragedy with poor Ilara, one assumed you had sworn off the fairer sex entirely. The mention of his late wife's name was a deliberate cruelty, a poisoned dart aimed at Alistair's composure. Serafina tensed, her hand tightening on Alistair's arm. She felt the muscle beneath her fingers go rigid as stone. Alistair turned his head slowly, his gaze fixing on the Viscount with an unnerving, predatory stillness. My first wife's name, he said, his voice soft but laced with ice, is not a topic for casual drawing-room conversation. Particularly not from you, Harrington. I would advise you to remember that. Edward paled slightly, taken aback by the quiet venom in the Duke's tone. He quickly tried to recover, turning his attention back to Serafina with a patronizing smile. I trust His Grace is treating you well. He has a reputation for being a demanding man. I recall the night of the fire, the one that took poor Ilara. The whole county was talking for months. Such a terrible, violent end. A man's temper can be a frightful thing. The words were a clear, malicious insinuation, meant to frighten her, to plant a seed of doubt about the man she had married, but it was the detail that snagged in Serafina's mind. The night of the fire, how would he know anything specific about it? He was a London fop. He shouldn't have any knowledge of a private country tragedy beyond common gossip. It was a small thing, a discordant note in his carefully constructed performance, but it lodged in her memory. Before she could process it, the drawing-room door creaked open. Lily, who was supposed to be with her governess, stood on the threshold, her eyes wide. She had clearly slipped away to see the visitors. Isolde's eyes lit up with malicious glee. Oh, and this must be the little one. How quaint! She's terribly pale, isn't she? And so silent. One hears she hasn't spoken a word since the incident. The cruelty was breathtaking. Lily flinched as if struck, her face crumpling. She let out a small, terrified whimper and backed away. It was Alistair who moved first. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, sweeping a stunned Lily up into his arms. He held her close, his large hand stroking her hair, murmuring something soft and reassuring against her ear that only she could hear. He turned, his body a shield between his daughter and the visitors, his face a thundercloud of controlled fury. The visit, he said, his voice dangerously low, is over. Show them out, Mrs. Gable. He strode from the room without a backward glance, carrying his daughter as if she were the most precious treasure in the world. Serafina was left to face the Harringtons. She rose to her feet, her composure absolute. As my husband said, she stated, her voice like chipping ice, your visit is at an end. Do not presume to call on us again. They left, their smug superiority finally punctured, leaving a wake of poisoned silence behind them. That night, the house felt different. The shared challenge had forged a new, unspoken bond between them. They had stood together, a family, against an outside threat. Later, a terrible storm of shrieking wind and wailing nightmares descended upon Blackwood. Lily's screams ripped through the quiet corridors. Serafina, her heart pounding, rushed from her room, meeting Alistair in the hallway. They reached the child's room at the same time. Lily was sitting bolt upright in her bed, her eyes wide with terror, caught in the grip of a nightmare. The fire! She shrieked, her small hands clutching at the blankets. The bright, hot fire! And the shouting! Mamma was shouting! Serafina went to her, gathering the trembling child into her arms, rocking her gently. Hush, little one, it was just a dream. You're safe now. Alistair stood in the doorway, his face ashen. He looked utterly helpless, a powerful man rendered impotent by his child's pain and his own inescapable past. He watched as Serafina calmed his daughter, her soft voice a soothing balm in the dark, stormy room. He saw her gentle patience, her genuine compassion. Their eyes met over Lily's dark, tangled hair. In that moment, they were not a duke and his convenient duchess. They were 2 people, bound by a shared vulnerable concern for a terrified child. The walls between them for that one night seemed to crumble into dust. The storm that raged outside Blackwood Manor was a pale imitation of the tempest unleashed within its walls. Lily's nightmare had broken something open, a seal on a past that had been left to fester in darkness. After she finally cried herself to sleep in Serafina's arms, Alistair had stood in the doorway, his face a mask of such profound agony that it stole the breath from her lungs. Walk with me, he said, his voice rough, as if torn from his throat. It was not a request. He led her not to his study or to the formal drawing room, but down a corridor she had never explored towards the closed-off west wing. The air grew colder, staler, thick with the dust of years. He stopped before a heavy oak door and produced a single ornate iron key from his waistcoat pocket. The lock turned with a grating shriek of protest, the sound of a tomb being unsealed. He pushed the door open and stepped aside, allowing her to enter first. The room was a lady's bedchamber, but it was unlike any she had ever seen. It was frozen in time, a scene of chaos preserved under a thick blanket of dust and cobwebs. A wardrobe door hung open, revealing empty hangers. A jewel box lay on its side on the dressing table, its velvet lining bare. Gowns were strewn across a chaise lounge, and in the center of the floor, a small overturned oil lantern lay beside a dark, ugly scorch mark on the priceless Aubusson carpet. The air was thick with the faint phantom scent of smoke and old perfume. This was where it had happened. This was Ilara's room. "This is how it was," Alistair said, his voice hollow, echoing in the dead space. "I ordered it sealed. I could not erase it. So I entombed it." He walked to the window, his back to her, and stared out at the thrashing, rain-lashed trees. The storm provided a fitting soundtrack to the story that finally, agonizingly, began to spill from him. "She was not happy here," he began, his words clipped and painful. "I knew that. I thought it was the country, the isolation. I thought a child would change things. It didn't. It only seemed to push her further away." He paused, his breath shuddering. "She was beautiful, vivacious, like a hummingbird trapped in a cage of stone. This house, I smothered her." Serafina remained silent, her heart aching for the pain he had carried alone for so long. This was not the cold, unfeeling Duke, but a man drowning in guilt. "That night," he continued, his voice dropping to a whisper, "she told me she was leaving. She had packed her jewels, her favorite gowns. She was leaving me, and she was taking Lily with her. She told me she had found someone else, someone who understood her, someone in London." He turned from the window, his face ravaged by the memory. "I was insane with rage, with grief. How could she take my child from me? We argued, vicious, terrible things were said. I called her selfish, a faithless mother. She threw the lantern. I don't know if she meant to or if it slipped in her anger. It fell, the oil spilling, the flame catching on the rug instantly. He closed his eyes, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists at his sides. There was smoke. Panic. She ran for the door, but the fire was spreading so fast. I tried to get to her. But a ceiling timber fell. It blocked my path. The last thing I saw was her face through the flames, the look of terror in her eyes. The servants came. They pulled me out. They couldn't reach her. I failed her. My anger, my fury, it created the inferno that consumed her. I killed my wife, Serafina. Whether by my hand or by my rage, the result is the same." The confession hung in the air, raw and devastating. He had been living with this belief, this soul-crushing guilt for 6 years. He had walled off his heart, walled off these rooms, believing himself to be a monster responsible for the death of his wife. Serafina's mind was reeling, not just from the horror of his story, but from the pieces that were suddenly, shockingly, clicking into place. A discordant note, a detail he shouldn't know. "I recall the night of the fire. Such a terrible, violent end." Harrington's words from that afternoon echoed in her head. Common gossip would not have included details of a violent end or a man's temper. That was too specific. That was the kind of detail one would only know if one were intimately connected to the events. "She told me she had found someone else, someone who understood her, someone in London." The blood drained from Serafina's face. It couldn't be. The coincidence was too great, the cruelty too immense. "Alistair," she said, her voice soft but urgent, her use of his given name unconscious. "Harrington, Viscount Harrington. Was he the man?" Alistair looked at her, his expression clouded with confusion. "What? No, I don't know. She never told me his name. What has Harrington to do with this?" "Today," Serafina explained, her mind racing, "when he was here, he spoke of the fire. He said it was a violent end and hinted at your temper. But he spoke of it with a familiarity, an undertone. That was wrong. He is a London gossip, Alistair. How would he know the intimate details of a private tragedy that happened years ago, miles from the city, unless he was there, or unless he was the cause?" The realization dawned on Alistair's face, a slow wave of horror that eclipsed even the guilt. The possibility was so monstrous it was almost unthinkable that the man who had publicly humiliated Serafina was the same man who had secretly destroyed his own family. The affair was one thing, but to have been involved, to have known. He broke our engagement, Serafina whispered, thinking aloud, the pieces forming a sickening picture. I thought it was just for Isolde's money, but what if it was more? What if my family's connection to this county, my presence here, made me a liability? What if he feared that by marrying me, he would be drawn back into a circle where his past secrets might be exposed? He didn't just want a richer wife, he wanted to silence a potential link to his past. Alistair stared at her, the implications of her words sinking in. His guilt had been a fog, obscuring his memory, making him the villain in his own story. But Serafina's logic was a sharp, clean wind, beginning to cut through it. He had been so consumed by his own part in the argument that he had never considered the other man as anything more than a faceless catalyst. But Harrington's presence, his goading words, his connection to Serafina, it was all too much to be a coincidence. The shouting, Serafina said, her eyes wide as she remembered Lily's nightmare. Lily said she heard shouting, plural, not just her mother. But she didn't mention you. The storm outside raged, mirroring the turmoil in the room. Alistair's entire understanding of the worst night of his life was fracturing, breaking apart to reveal a different, more complex and perhaps more sinister truth. He had carried the burden of guilt for so long, it had become a part of him. The idea that he might not be the monster he believed himself to be was as terrifying as it was liberating. He looked at Serafina, truly looked at her, not as his convenient Duchess, but as the woman who had quietly, patiently tended the garden of his neglected heart, who had coaxed his silent daughter back into the world of the living, and who now, with her clear-eyed intelligence, was shining a light into the darkest, most painful corner of his soul. He had offered her a loveless contract, and she had given him a chance at redemption. The revelation of the past was agonizing, but in that shared moment of discovery, a new and powerful connection was being forged between them. A bond not of convenience, but of profound, emerging trust. The weight of the revelation settled in the dusty, silent room, changing everything. Alistair looked around at the preserved chaos, at the relics of his guilt, and saw it all through new eyes. The narrative he had built around his own monstrosity was crumbling, and in its place was a void of uncertainty, filled only by the quiet, steady presence of the woman before him. He sank onto the edge of the dust-sheeted chaise lounge, the fight seeming to go out of him, replaced by a deep, hollow exhaustion. All this time, he murmured, his voice ragged, I have lived in this prison of my own making, believing my rage was the spark. I never allowed myself to consider anything else. It was easier, perhaps, to accept the blame than to face the truth of her betrayal. Serafina moved to stand before him, her presence a small, warm anchor in the cold, ghost-filled room. She did not offer platitudes or easy reassurances. She offered something far more valuable, her belief. Your anger did not light the flame, Alistair. Your grief and guilt have been telling you a story that isn't true. You have been punishing yourself for a crime you did not commit. She knelt before him, taking his large, clenched hands in her own. His skin was cold, but his grip when he instinctively tightened it around hers was strong, desperate. You are not the man you have believed yourself to be for all these years, she said, her gaze firm and unwavering, compelling him to meet her eyes. I have seen you with Lily. I have seen your quiet acts of kindness. I see you now. The man I see is not a monster. He is a man who has been in unbearable pain. Her compassion was a balm on a wound that had been festering for 6 long years. For the first time since that terrible night, he felt a flicker of something other than self-loathing. He saw a sliver of daylight through the cracks of his prison. He looked at her earnest, intelligent face, illuminated by the flashes of lightning from the storm outside, and he felt the last of his carefully constructed defenses wash away. He had brought her to this house as a convenience, a shield, a placeholder. He had expected her to be a silent, decorative fixture. Instead, she had brought life to his dead garden, music to his silent halls, and now, clarity to his haunted mind. She had done it all with a quiet grace and a strength he had never witnessed in anyone. Slowly he raised a hand, his fingers trembling slightly, and brushed a stray lock of hair from her cheek. The touch was electric, a spark of life in the dead room. Her skin was soft, warm. It was the first time he had touched her with anything approaching tenderness. The gesture was tentative, questioning, and in her eyes he saw no fear, no revulsion, only a deep, resonant empathy. Serafina, he breathed, her name a prayer on his lips. The space between them narrowed, charged with years of unspoken sorrow and a fragile, burgeoning hope. He leaned in, and she met him halfway. Their first kiss was not a fiery, passionate affair. It was something far more profound. It was gentle, hesitant, a soft meeting of lips that tasted of salt from tears he hadn't realized he'd shed. It was a kiss of gratitude, of absolution, of a shared humanity. It was the breaking of a long and terrible fever. In that single, quiet moment, the contract was broken. The business arrangement was dissolved. The cold, empty truce was over. He was no longer just the Duke, and she was no longer just his Duchess. They were Alistair and Seraphina, two broken people finding solace and the first tentative promise of healing in each other's arms. The storm outside continued to rage, but within the walls of the sealed room, a different kind of storm had finally, mercifully passed. The kiss deepened, gaining a quiet confidence, a sense of discovery. It was a promise of a new beginning, a turning point from which there could be no return. The house was still full of ghosts, but for the first time they were not alone in it. The days following the storm were quiet, but it was a new kind of quiet. The oppressive, heavy silence of grief had been replaced by a softer, more contemplative stillness, filled with unspoken understanding. The barrier between the east and west wings, while still physically present, had dissolved emotionally. Alistair no longer confined himself to his study. He would seek Seraphina out in the garden, not just watching from the window, but standing with her, his hands clasped behind his back, as she explained her plans for the spring planting. He would listen, truly listen, his gaze focused and present. They made the decision together, a silent mutual agreement not to pursue a public confrontation with Harrington. To do so would be to drag Ilara's name and Lily's through the mud of a public scandal. It would achieve nothing but more pain. Harrington's character, they reasoned, would be his own undoing. A man built on such rotten foundations could not stand tall for long. Their focus now was not on revenge, but on rebuilding. The first step was to unseal the West Wing. With a team of trusted servants, they began the process of cleaning and restoring Ilara's rooms. It was a painful, cathartic process. Seraphina directed the work with a gentle sensitivity, ensuring that it felt less like an erasure and more like a respectful farewell. As they were carefully packing away the contents of a writing desk, Seraphina's fingers brushed against a false bottom in one of the drawers. Prying it open, she discovered a small leather-bound journal. It was Ilara's diary. Her last entries were a revelation. They were filled with a desperate unhappiness, a feeling of being trapped and misunderstood. She wrote of Alistair's deep, abiding love for the land and his home, a love she could not share. She described him as a good man, a steadfast man, but one whose roots were sunk too deep in the soil of Blackwood for a restless soul like hers. And then she wrote of Harrington. She depicted him not as a great love, but as an escape. He was London, he was excitement, he was a way out. Her final entry, written on the afternoon of her death, was stark and resolute. He is here, I have told A, it is done, I will be free. Seraphina brought the journal to Alistair that evening. As he stood by the fire in the main library, she watched his face as he read the final pages, saw the complex play of emotions, the lingering pain of her betrayal, but also, finally, the lifting of a great and terrible burden. The journal confirmed his story, but it also freed him. He had not driven a happy, loving wife away with his temper. He had been married to a woman who was already gone, a woman who was fundamentally unsuited to the life he could offer. Her death was a tragedy, born of her own recklessness and another man's cowardice. But it was not the sin for which he had been punishing himself for 6 years. He closed the journal and placed it gently on the mantelpiece. He looked at Seraphina, his eyes clear and free of the shadows that had haunted them for so long. "Thank you," he said, the words simple but imbued with a world of meaning. The following week, a rare spell of warm, sunny weather descended on Blackwood, a false spring that coaxed the first crocuses and snowdrops into bloom in the walled garden. The air was soft, holding the promise of renewal. It was there, amidst the signs of new life, that Alistair finally broke the last of the silence between them. He found her kneeling by a bed of purple crocuses, the very ones she had sketched for Lily what seemed like a lifetime ago. He stood for a moment, simply watching her, a small, gentle smile touching his lips, a sight so rare it felt like a miracle. "When you first came here," he began, his voice quiet, making her look up, "I gave you a contract, rules, walls. I was a man living in a tomb of his own making, and I intended for you to live in it with me. I offered you my name in exchange for your freedom. It was the most dishonorable bargain of my life." He knelt beside her on the damp earth, heedless of the dirt on his trousers. He took her soil-smudged hand in his. "You, Seraphina, did not honor that bargain. You refused to live in the dark. You came to this dead place, and you cultivated life. You tended this garden, you tended my daughter, and you tended to me, though I neither asked for it nor deserved it. You brought light back to Blackwood." His thumb stroked the back of her hand, sending a shiver of warmth through her. I no longer want a Duchess of convenience. I do not want a partner in a contract. I want a wife. I want a partner in my life. I want a mother for my child, not one of name, but one of heart, which you already are. He paused, his dark eyes searching hers, all his vulnerability laid bare. I have fallen in love with you, Serafina. I know I have no right to ask it, after everything I've put you through, but I must. Could you ever find it in your heart to love the man, and not just the Duke? Tears welled in Serafina's eyes, tears of pure, unadulterated joy. The journey had been so long, so filled with loneliness and uncertainty, but it had led them here, to this perfect, honest moment. Her feelings for him had grown so gradually, so quietly, that she hadn't even dared to put a name to them. They had started as compassion, shifted to respect, deepened into a fierce, protective affection, and had finally, irrevocably, blossomed into love. "Oh, Alistair," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I believe I have loved the man for a very long time. I was just waiting for him to step out from the Duke's shadow." His smile, when it came, was one of pure, radiant relief. It transformed his entire face, chasing away the last vestiges of his old sorrow. He leaned in and kissed her, a deep, heartfelt kiss filled with all the promises of the future. It was a kiss of declaration, of commitment, of a love that had been hard-won and was all the more precious for it. In the quiet, blooming garden, surrounded by the life she had so patiently nurtured, their new life together was finally, truly, beginning. 1 year later, the late afternoon sun of a perfect English summer slanted through the tall windows of Blackwood Manor, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The house was no longer silent, it was filled with a low, happy hum of life. The sound of Lily, now a chattering, confident 7-year-old, could be heard from the lawn, where she was engaged in a serious discussion with Mr. Abernathy about the optimal placement of a new rose bush. Mrs. Gable, the stern housekeeper, had been seen to smile on no less than 3 separate occasions that month. The entire estate, it seemed, had exhaled a breath it had been holding for nearly a decade. Serafina stood in the doorway of the main drawing-room, a hand resting on the gentle swell of her stomach. The room, once shrouded in dust sheets and sorrow, was now light and airy. The heavy velvet curtains had been replaced with pale linen, and vases of flowers from her garden graced every surface. The grand piano stood gleaming, its lid open, a sheet of music resting on its stand, waiting. Alistair came to stand behind her, his arms wrapping gently around her, his chin resting on her shoulder. He followed her gaze out to the garden. It was a riot of color and life, a testament to a year of patient, loving work. The climbing roses scaled the new trellises, their blooms heavy and fragrant. The paths were clear, the beds overflowing with lavender, delphiniums, and countless other flowers. It was a sanctuary reborn, a perfect mirror of the hearts of those who now tended it. "She looks happy," Alistair said, his voice a low, contented rumble against her ear. He was watching his daughter, his expression filled with a peaceful, profound love. He was a different man from the haunted figure she had met at the ball. The harsh lines on his face had softened, the shadows in his eyes had been replaced by a warm, steady light. He laughed easily now, a deep, rich sound that had become Serafina's favorite music. "She is happy," Serafina agreed, leaning back against his solid strength. "We all are." Lily, spotting them in the doorway, abandoned her horticultural consultation and ran towards them, her dark curls flying behind her. She launched herself into her father's arms, and he swung her up effortlessly. "Papa, Serafina! Mr. Abernathy says the new rose is a Duchess of Blackwood rose, because it is both strong and beautiful, just like you," she exclaimed, planting a kiss on Serafina's cheek. Serafina's heart felt so full it might burst. The title, once so foreign and cold, now felt as natural as her own name, warmed by the love of this small, bright child. "I think Mr. Abernathy is a very wise man," Alistair said, his eyes meeting Serafina's over their daughter's head. The look that passed between them was one of complete, unshakable love and partnership. It held the memory of the dark path they had walked and the joy of the sunlit clearing they had found together. Later that evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of rose and violet, they sat together on the stone bench in the walled garden. The air was sweet with the scent of night-blooming jasmine. Lily was asleep upstairs, her dreams for the first time in her life untroubled. Alistair took Serafina's hand, his fingers lacing through hers. "Do you ever think of that night?" he asked quietly. "The ball." Serafina considered it. The memory, once a source of searing humiliation, had faded. It felt like a scene from someone else's life, a prologue to a much better story. "Sometimes," she admitted, "I think of it as the night my life truly began. It was a terrible, cruel ending that led to the most beautiful beginning I could ever have imagined." He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a soft kiss to her knuckles. "To new beginnings," he murmured against her skin. She smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that reached her eyes and filled them with light. "To us." They sat in comfortable silence as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Two souls who had found each other in the wreckage of the past and had built a future more beautiful than either had dared to hope for. Blackwood. Manor was no longer a prison or a tomb. It was a home filled with light, laughter, and a love that had been nurtured from the most barren of ground, proving that even after the longest, coldest winter, spring will always, eventually, return. Dear listener, how often do we find ourselves defined by a moment of public failure or private heartbreak? Like Serafina, we can be left standing in the center of a silent ballroom, the whispers of judgment and the weight of our own perceived ruin threatening to pull us under. It is so easy, in those moments, to believe that this is the end of our story. We build walls around our hearts, just as Alistair did, convinced that the pain is a life sentence, that the grief is a room we can never leave. We tend to our sorrow, letting the gardens of our own potential grow wild and untended. But Serafina's story reminds us of the quiet, revolutionary power of taking a single small step. She did not set out to heal a duke or save a family. She simply decided to tend a garden. She chose to cultivate a small patch of beauty in the midst of desolation. She focused not on the grand, imposing fortress of Alistair's grief, but on the single, struggling rose bush that needed her care. So often, our own healing begins in the same way. It starts not with a grand declaration, but with a quiet act of creation. It might be planting a window box, finishing a book, learning a simple song on the piano, or reaching out to a lonely child. These small acts of tending to the life around us have a miraculous way of tending to the life within us. They are a declaration that we will not be defined by our endings, but by the new beginnings we are willing to cultivate. Like Serafina, we can choose to pick up a trowel in the face of despair. And in doing so, we may just find that we are not only restoring a forgotten garden, but unearthing the resilience, compassion, and love that have been lying dormant in our own hearts all along. The greatest transformations rarely arrive with a trumpet blast. More often, they begin with the simple, hopeful act of planting a single seed in the dark. Thank you for joining me for this story. If you enjoyed this journey of love and healing, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing it with someone who might need a reminder that even the most neglected gardens can bloom again. Your support allows me to continue bringing these stories to you. Until next time,